Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. I think this is episode number 44 of The Raw Men, and today I'm going to be interviewing George Maschke, and we met him in the Netherlands, and he is the founder of antipolygraph.org. Apparently, as I understand it, he was a FBI applicant, and they accused him of being a spy when they ran him through the polygraph test. So, of course, my big question is, to find out why did he lie to this agency and also to hear about his secret life in espionage. George Maschke, how do you do, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. And it's good to speak with you, Aaron. It was good to see you in Delft. Um, well, I should clarify that the FBI didn't exactly precisely call me a spy, but in so many words, they made accusations that would point in that direction.
I see.
That was in 21 years ago, in 1995, when I applied to be an FBI special agent. And I had a pre-employment polygraph, which they had just started doing at that time. Interestingly, Aldrich Ames, the CIA spy who was spying for the Russians and had beat the polygraph twice, well, he had just been arrested recently, and the FBI thought, since I don't know why, but that it would be a good idea for them to start requiring polygraph screening for new FBI applicants. So I was among the first, and I was at the time a U.S. Army Reserve officer in the intelligence branch with a security clearance. And I was accused of lying when I denied that anyone had directed me to seek FBI employment, when I denied having ever divulged classified information to anyone unauthorized to receive it, and when I denied falsifying any information in my application, I think was the other accusation. So all these things put together, the strong implication is that I was some sort of agent for a foreign government trying to infiltrate the FBI, which was not the case. There was, to my knowledge, no espionage investigation launched. However, I was blacklisted from FBI employment for life, and that's what happens to everyone who fails the FBI pre-employment polygraph, which has a failure rate of about 50% now.
So you said it would block you from any further jobs with the FBI, but it's broader than
Mhm.
that, isn't it?
Well, yes, if you fail a polygraph with one federal agency, you can end up being blacklisted from other federal agencies, and even ones that won't blacklist you, you may have a harder time finding employment with. So it has negative career implications for anyone to fail a polygraph. And well, when this happened to me, uh, I was a graduate student at UCLA, and so I went to the research library and I read everything I could find about polygraphy. Um, my polygraph examiner had told me that I think that it was like 97 or 98% accurate. And so I was wondering how I happened to be one of those hapless people who fell within the 2% margin of error of an otherwise scientific test. Um, so I was angered and uh, very, very concerned when I learned that, in fact, polygraphy doesn't have any scientific basis at all. It's a pseudoscientific procedure that was cooked up by interrogators, not
Mhm.
scientists. Um, and so when I found out that what happened to me was happening to many other people, uh, a few years after my polygraph experience, I co-founded antipolygraph.org with another fellow, Gino Scalabrini, to make what I had learned about polygraphy and what others had also contributed available to the public, so that people who are facing polygraph screening or polygraphs for any situation, for example, criminal investigations, a jealous spouse who wants the polygraph, or now even people who have been convicted, usually of a sex crime, and are on parole, may have to take polygraphs to prove that they're complying with the terms of their release. All these important decisions are being made based on pseudoscience, and people need to understand this. Um, and what's all this sadder about it is that we have the United States government and state and local government agencies promoting public belief in a procedure that has no scientific basis.
Okay,
And
I want to ask
sure,
you
go ahead.
something about that. I mean, because I often bring up in presentations about skepticism that the way that we were raised in this culture is we've been trained to accept an awful lot of woo because the government has been using it. Like Project Blue Book. Where the government was investigating UFO experience. So
Mhm.
this gives credence to the idea of extraterrestrial visitors and all of this. And when people would, like police departments would actually hire psychics to try to help them find somebody.
Mhm.
So this gives credence so that people think
Right.
that there's some validity to this. And then you're talking about these applications like for jilted lovers versus or jealous lovers, whatever, who want to use these polygraphs. Well, the similar thing has been done with like hypnotists and so forth, investigating people's past lives. And so again, we give credence lent to something that is completely made up. But
Mhm.
when we talk about, let's say, alternative medicine, you have magnet therapy and the foot massages and homeopathy and things of that sort. We want to put often the chiropractors with their subluxations in the same category, but there's not quite this. It's not quite exactly the same because apparently chiropractors can actually do some kind of physical therapy. Subluxations are still fictitious, but the physical therapy still has some value. So, are we looking at the polygraph in the same kind of category that we're looking at chiropractor? Is there any justice or substance to it at all, or is it just as vacuous as hypnotism?
From a scientific standpoint, it has no basis whatsoever. Uh,
So
from a
it really is just as empty a concept as hypnotism.
Yes, it has no theoretical basis, and it's never been proved through peer-reviewed research to work at better than chance levels under field conditions.
Outstanding.
However, however, it does have some utility, which is as a prop for an interrogation. For example, if you can get a dumb criminal into an interrogation room alone with a polygraph operator who's also a trained interrogator without a lawyer present, he can often get information that will be useful to investigators. And that's really why the US government uses it to the extent that it does, is that it's useful for getting information from gullible, credulous people.
Well, I've heard of many applications being used for that.
Yes, yes.
It doesn't even have to require a special room and devices. You just it's easy to fool some gullible people. I had a polygraph experience once upon a time, and I many years ago, and I remember wondering, that there are people who are uh, naturally concerned about whether the things that they say are true, right? And when
Hmm.
you give a yes or no question, are there exceptions? Are there parameters? And you want to be as accurate as possible. And so you actually get nervous about that sort of thing. Whereas other people I've encountered don't have any compunction about that sort of thing at all. And they could,
Hmm.
in my opinion, they could just breeze. The most dishonest people could easily breeze through a polygraph test. There wouldn't be any effort.
Well,
Is that incorrect?
there,
Assessment?
there's there's not research to support such a conclusion or to refute it. But there are some notorious examples. For example, there's a serial killer named Gary Leon Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, who early on in the investigation of these strings of murderers of mostly prostitutes, I think, he was an early suspect, and he was given a polygraph test, and he passed it. Meanwhile,
Now,
an innocent person,
this is the guy that's being interviewed for a murder. So I mean, if you're going to get murder, if you're going to get nervous about anything, that would be the thing, right?
right? That's as high stakes as it gets, and he passed and was excluded as a suspect for quite some years, during which he continued his killing spree. Meanwhile, investigators became suspicious of a person uh, whom we now know is innocent, uh, who had volunteered to help, who came forth with information he thought might be helpful. And so that's immediately suspicious. And he failed a polygraph, and he was the focus of investigation, misdirecting the investigation because of misplaced public reliance on polygraph results.
I don't know how to
So
follow that up.
Well,
So
well,
somebody
this,
comes out of the blue and thinks that they're going to help, and then suddenly somehow they've said something
yes,
wrong, and
vol
maybe,
in a, volunteering to help the police with a murder investigation can make you a suspect because they may think that maybe this is a perpetrator who's trying to misdirect the police.
so
Uh,
just remember, kids, never help.
well, good advice I think would be not to speak with law enforcement investigators without a lawyer present.
Okay. So,
And
in your experience, where does this where does this continue? The FBI thing gets started with you. You start this organization, and what's the next step from there?
well, shortly after that, I remained in the U.S. Army Reserve and continued to hold a security clearance. And that was revoked shortly after antipolygraph.org went online in the year 2000.
Wait a minute,
Um,
they didn't revoke your security clearance for the polygraph. They revoked it because of your movement against the polygraph.
I suspect that's the case, that it was retaliatory. It
Okay.
happened very quickly after I gave an interview with a reporter for the Washington Post who mentioned in his article that I held a security clearance at the time.
Ah,
And
I can see the correlation. Yeah.
yeah, so um, in any event, the US government is not happy about the existence of antipolygraph.org or other individuals who share publicly information about polygraph tests, and especially about how they can be passed or beaten. So,
You
so
mentioned
go ahead.
you mentioned how not just the government uses these, but a number of other different avenues. What is the breadth of the application of polygraphs? How many different people use it for what different reasons?
Well, as an example, most federal law enforcement agencies require applicants to take the polygraph, as do the intelligence services, the CIA, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial Agency, uh, the National Reconnaissance Office, all of these polygraph applicants, but they also polygraph their employees on a continuing basis to make sure that they're obeying the rules. Uh, it's widely used also by state and local law enforcement departments, especially in your state of Texas, uh, to a large extent in my home state of California. Um, there's only, I think, 5 states in the US where state and local law enforcement do not polygraph at all, and that's because it's prohibited by state law.
And why would there be a state law prohibiting a polygraph test?
Largely through the efforts of labor unions, who there was a time, especially in the 1970s and 80s, when polygraph screening was widely used uh, by private employers, especially retail outlets or stores, any place with employees that handled cash. They would require them to take lie detector tests to try to ensure that they weren't taking money from the till, or to make sure that people they hired would be, good hires who were honest employees. And this resulted in many innocent people being falsely accused of deception. And organized labor rallied against that. And so in some states, legislation was passed prohibiting it across the board. At the federal level, a law called the Employee Polygraph Protection Act was passed in 1988 by a Democratic Congress, signed by Republican President Ronald Reagan, and it greatly restricted the use of polygraphs by private employers, but it has a blanket exemption for federal, state, and local governments. So
See, I was tested once in Texas just to go to work in a record store, because they
mhm.
wanted to know about drug histories, and I guess they didn't have any better way of ascertaining that than a
Right,
polygraph.
that was quite common 30 years ago.
Well, let me ask you about the application of this, because I mean, I saw this interview that where you were interviewed by Nick Frost,
Mhm.
and he took a polygraph test as a result of your conversation, and he failed it. So, I mean, if that's the case, I mean, there is, and he was trying to beat it. So, is there? Again, I mean, I know you said there's no legitimacy, but why did he fail?
Well, It's hard to say precisely. Didn't see a recording of the examination. I wasn't there for it. I haven't seen the charts. Uh, but if you go to a polygraph examiner and let him know that, hey, I'm going to see if I can beat your test, it's likely that you're going to fail the test. In fact, certainly with polygraphers in the United States, especially in law enforcement and intelligence screening, if you go into the polygraph and you say, hey, I know how it works. I went to antipolygraph.org and I read their book, The Lie Behind the Lie Detector, and I know the procedure, what the questions are. I know the true function of the control, irrelevant, and relevant questions. So, you know,
So that's exactly what happened in that interrogation of Nick Frost. The guy actually said that, okay, you're failing the control questions, and this tells me that you're lying.
yeah,
So
and that was a nonsensical answer because polygraphers expect to see strong reactions on the control questions from people who pass the test. So it was a nonsense answer that he gave, and I don't think. Well, I can say when I went to that interview, Nick Frost didn't know anything about polygraphs at all. Really, he learned when I told him by the Thames River that morning, 13 years
I
ago.
think also having watched that, I also think that when he confessed to having stolen those cakes, that he didn't really steal the cakes. I think that's the joke there, that he's lying about having even done that, and that's what the polygraph got him on. I guess we'll have to put him on a different test to find out if that's what he lied about.
Mm, well, anyway, this brings up an interesting topic: is how the polygraph can be beaten. Because in founding antipolygraph.org, one of the key things that we had in mind was that people who face polygraph screening uh, and the public at large should have information available about how the test works and its shortcomings and how it can be beaten. And this is information that, while it was available in university research libraries, most people didn't have ready access to. Um, I was fortunate at the time of my polygraph experience to be at UCLA, which has quite a good research library.
Okay,
So,
so let me ask you first before we get into when you go in for a when you go in for a polygraph, they
mhm.
outfit you, and I don't know if the way that they use it now is the same way that they did it 30 some odd years ago when I took it, but how do they wire you up, and what is it that they're trying to be sensitive for, or trying to detect?
Okay, good question. What does it measure? The measures are the same as 30 years ago, same as 50 years ago, same as close to 70 years ago. Uh, they measure galvanic skin response, which is a function of polymer sweating. So that's done by attaching typically two metal plates to the index and ring fingers.
Hmm.
There's breathing, which is typically by two pneumatic tubes um, or strain gauges, actually, that are stretched around the upper chest and abdomen. And so that measures not only depth of breathing, but the breathing rate. And there's a blood pressure cuff, which purportedly measures changes in blood pressure, although it's unclear exactly what that's measuring. And heart rate can be gauged accurately from that.
Now, can
So
all of these things be controlled consciously?
to a certain extent,
Okay.
for example, it's difficult to suppress a reaction to a question. So let's say you let's say you robbed the bank and you're in the polygraph chair and you're asked the question, did you rob the bank? Uh, it'll be You might well show a reaction to that question, sweat a little bit more, your heart might race a little bit. You can quite easily control your breathing. But these other indices are very difficult to control. Reactions are hard to suppress. Uh, but to pass the polygraph or to beat it, you don't need to do that. Uh, the polygraphers understand that even the innocent person might react strongly to that relevant question. So they've devised what they call control or comparison questions. And these are questions where the subject's answer is secretly expected to be not true. For example, if the relevant question is, did you rob the bank? A comparison or control question for that might be, did you ever take anything that did not belong to you? And it'll be explained to the examinee that, people who take things and don't return them are the same kind of people who show lack of concern about the welfare of others and who would do something like robbing a bank. And so they try to shoehorn or steer the examinee into answering that question no, whereas they secretly expect that everyone has taken something at one time and failed to return it, or pilfered something from work, and so forth. So they will assume that if the person shows a stronger reaction to this control question about ever taking anything that didn't belong to them, than to the relevant question about robbing the bank, then they must be telling the truth about not robbing the bank. On the other hand, if you know that the bank was robbed and you're a suspect, and that disturbs you a lot, whether you're guilty or innocent, and it disturbs you more than this question about ever taking anything that didn't belong to you, then you're going to fail the test, whether you're guilty or innocent. And it's not hard to see how this procedure has a built-in bias against truthful people, because the relevance or emotional impact of the so-called control questions can rarely match the relevant questions, which are much more serious.
Well, that's exactly what I was talking about when I said that, honest people who have, some concern about whether the things that they say are actually true, are going to have, as you said, this system is biased against them. So they're going to be just naturally more nervous than somebody who doesn't give a damn
right
what he says is true or not.
And suppose you're especially honest and you say, well, yeah, actually, I did take some things. I borrowed my neighbor's lawnmower, and actually it's still in my garage 2 months after I borrowed it. I haven't given it back to him. I remember, I pilfered some things from my mother's coin tray when I was a child. And the more you unload litanies of things like that, and then feel relaxed when you say, well, they'll adjust the question and say, other than what you told me, did you ever take anything that didn't belong to you? And so until you can answer that question, no. So when you've unburdened your conscience and you finally answer that question no, and you feel, okay, I'm good now, ironically, and perversely, you're more likely to fail the polygraph, because you're less likely to show a reaction to that control question, and it's more likely that your response to the relevant question will be stronger. So this comparison of control questions versus relevant questions, this is not something that was thought up by scientists and tested with double-blinded research. This is the brainchild of interrogators, and it has no scientific basis whatsoever. And as clever people might surmise, you can game the test by augmenting reactions to the control questions. So suppose you did rob the bank, but you have also done your research on polygraph testing, and you know about the true function of the control questions, which you're not supposed to know. And when you're asked that question about, did you ever take anything that didn't belong to you, you start doing a difficult math problem in your head as fast as you can. And you suppress your breathing for a few seconds, breathing out and holding it for a few seconds before you resume breathing, producing a reaction that's indistinguishable from what the polygraphers are looking for from both truthful and deceptive people, but to the control question. Then you may very well beat the test. And so this is another concern about misplaced official reliance on polygraphy, that liars who don't even have to be, cool at lying or have no sense of guilt, they don't have to be practice lawyers, but to understand this procedure and to augment reactions to control questions, they can beat the test and not be detected. And there's reason to believe that a DIA spy, a Defense Intelligence Agency spy, her name was Annabella Montes, who was a double agent for Cuba at the time she applied for employment with the Defense Intelligence Agency, employed precisely these sorts of techniques to gain employment with the Defense Intelligence Agency. And she went on to become the Defense Department's senior analyst for Cuban affairs, all the while she was a spy for Cuba. On the other hand, there's no documented example where the polygraph has ever caught a spy. So
it's just as effective as the TEA.
What is the TEA?
Oh, or the T, how is it? When you go into the airport, I can't remember what they call the thing. When you go to the airport and they have these the people that run you through all of the security scanners and all of this, pat you down and X-ray.
Oh, the TSA.
TSA, yeah, okay.
Transport Security
Thank
Agency or Administration. Yes.
I wonder what TEA is. Well, never mind. But yeah, so these people have so far they 400 cases of having stolen things from customers, including myself, for example. But so far as yet, not one terrorist caught.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an astounding success rate. Now, since this is your area of interest, I'm sure that you've seen that one episode of Barney Miller, right?
I'm not sure that I have.
Okay. Well,
there's a lot of Barney Miller that I missed. It was on when I was a kid. I didn't watch it.
There was an old show called Barney Miller, and there was one episode that dealt with a polygraph. Mm-hmm. And I just remember that there was a character on there who went into the polygraph and he told the people that he was from Venus and so forth, and he sails through. He lies constantly and sails through the polygraph. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, thinking that probably you might have seen this just out of interest, and could you verify that anything he did was actually functionally accurate? Because obviously the Barney Miller thing predates the anti-polygraph organization that you started, right?
Oh, yes, by quite a number of years.
Yeah.
So I can't comment on that episode. I haven't seen it, but I'll seek it out and I'll let you know. By and large, the representations of polygraph testing that I've seen on television have not been the way it actually works. And
have there been any shows that you've seen on television that take your side of the argument that they're inaccurate?
Yes, Penn and Teller bullshit.
They still can't get why it's inaccurate?
Well, I should separate between police dramas or movies and such, and shows of a more documentary nation like Penn and Teller bullshit, which had an episode devoted to lie detectors. And I had the pleasure of talking extensively with the producer as he went into making of that, and he understood quite well that they were bullshit and why, and I think did a good job of getting as much as possible into the time available.
So what you're saying is that the only documentary that accurately understood why the polygraphs are wrong are the ones where the producer talked to you.
No. There's another show, and that was before bullshit, where Michael Shermer told the story about lie detectors and did research into it, and it's quite good. It's available on YouTube.
And this is independent. Michael Shermer's bit is independent of your work?
Yeah, I've never spoken with him.
Oh, okay.
So and nothing that we.
Were you on the bullshit episode with Penn and Teller?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they actually. I'm in the Netherlands now. They actually sent a film crew here from the UK. They drove drove boat and driving and came sit up right in my home here. So yeah.
Outstanding. All right, bullshit was one of my favorite shows for just propounding skepticism and getting people to think. You know, young
Hmm.
people think, because the way I was raised is completely different, and this is why I thought the bullshit was so refreshing. I was always taught to accept whatever I see on TV, that I was supposed to believe whatever I see in the news. You know, you read in the newspaper,
Hmm.
it's true, right? And I mean, really, I was raised not to question things. And so having shows like Bullshit, and how many other shows are there like? There's very, very few that
Hmm.
actually prompt people to think. I mean, there was one example that of a show like that had one of the guys from Star Trek, and he would be talking about, you know, whether this happened or whether it didn't happen. But the thing is almost every episode he's talking about things that are completely impossible and should be dismissed outright because they're talking about ghosts and telepathy and things of that sort. And then they always leave it ambiguous as to whether it happened or not. Well, this is not skepticism in any sense. It's not even like
Hmm.
that. So it's very refreshing to have, you know, a show like Bullshit, especially when Bullshit gets something wrong, as they've done a couple of times. You know, because Penn and Teller once upon a time were climate change denialists, and then, you know, changed their position after having learned more about it. So one of the things that I like about the internet and so forth is that you all of the information is out there. A lot of it is wrong, but the fact that a lot of it is wrong prompts you to have to think and analyze what you see, and be aware that even the news stories that you see might be pose and so forth. So I think that that helps encourage skepticism.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. And that's our main thrust now at antipolygraph.org is public education, that to inform as many people as we can about the shortcomings of calligraphy, and to give them ways to protect themselves if they are personally affected by it.
All
Now,
right, so
our
this is
first advice would be don't take it if at all possible. Don't do it.
is it possible to get out of that if your future employer, your prospective employer, or I mean, do they still do it for criminal investigations and that sort of thing? I mean,
Yes, quite a lot.
so there's no way out of that sort of thing, right? I mean,
Well, if you're suspected of a crime,
yeah,
you can refuse the polygraph, and you'd be well advised to refuse because,
really, you would be well advised to refuse.
yes, yes, because it's little more than a pretext for getting someone into an interrogation room without a lawyer.
Well, I just
And
want to clarify this because I mean, and I understand what you're saying, but when you refuse a polygraph, doesn't that already look suspicious, or would that matter anymore?
I think it doesn't really matter because if you're asked to take a polygraph, you're already a suspect.
Okay. All right. Well, fair enough. And what about for employers?
Now, employers, for example, like the federal agencies that require polygraph screening, you can refuse the polygraph. You don't have to take it, but you won't be hired.
And
And
likewise with not just prospective employers, but current employers. If your current employer requires, for what it demands, that you take a polygraph, what do you do then? Do you have a recourse then?
it depends on who your employer is. If it's a private company, then your employer may have violated the Employee Polygraph Protection Act just by asking you to take the polygraph.
Uh-huh. Okay, now
Uh,
this is variable in different states, is that right?
well, no, this is a federal law, so it
Okay.
applies in all states of the United States. Uh, but so if you're working for a private company, you probably have protection from the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, and you'd be well advised if asked to take a polygraph to speak with a lawyer with a background in labor law.
And one last thing, how would you advise people like the jealous lover that demands the polygraph? What's that situation about?
I always advise them to refuse the polygraph because it's demeaning, belittling, humiliating,
And
and
ultimately doesn't actually verify anything.
it doesn't verify anything. And I tell them, look, we have a book called The Lie Behind the Lie Detector. It's free. You can download it, read it. Read chapter 3, it'll tell you about the procedure. Read chapter 4, it'll tell you how to beat the test. But don't waste your money on the polygraph because I should say, I say it'll tell you how to beat the test. That's not usually the case that people are telling me that they want to uh, lie on it. Though sometimes they do. Um, Usually it's people saying I'm telling the truth, I'm wrongly suspected, and I'm just trying to convince my spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend or husband that I've been faithful.
Is there?
Uh,
Go ahead.
so if well, what I tell them is, you can read our book, you can use the countermeasures to the polygraph that we describe, but they can't guarantee that you'll pass. They can at best mitigate the risk of failing the polygraph. And even if you pass the polygraph, what's to prevent your significant other from going online, Googling polygraph, and finding the exact same information that you found, that, oh, the test is scientifically baseless and it's easy to beat, and you're back at square one. You've just
One of the
wasted a
things,
few $100s.
yeah. One of the things that confuses me about this is, how it's scientifically invalid. So why is it still being applied by government agencies?
Well, that's a very good question. I think some of it is bureaucratic inertia. The government agencies started adopting the polygraph for the most part shortly after World War II. Actually, the FBI started before World War II. They briefly stopped after a Nazi spy was able to pass a polygraph. At least they thought he was cooperating with them after they
Did you say
polygraphed
a
him.
Nazi spy?
Yeah, a Nazi spy.
So this is information that's quite old.
Yeah, well, the technique was different. So he probably used a different. I probably didn't use any technique at all except for just relaxing and trying to gain the confidence of the FBI agents. And
Okay, well, let me ask you one other thing. Is there a summary kind of explanation that people can give for why the polygraph has no scientific basis and can't really determine anything? Just a brief explanation that people might be able to give to their employer, to their spouse, to somebody like that, to say for why they're not going to take this test. Something that doesn't make them seem suspicious, but is a valid justification for why you don't take that test.
yeah, there's no physiological response measured by the polygraph instrument that is uniquely indicative of deception in humans. The reactions that they infer as indicating deception could just as well be caused by fear of being falsely accused of deception, embarrassment,
Which is
shame,
significant.
anger.
And,
Yes.
and that risk is really significant when you're in the classic interrogation room. I mean, the Nick Frost interview, for example, they had him in this weird arched way. I mean, there's just something about being in that room and being chained to that electric chair device and being interrogated that way. You may as well be sitting at the table with the two goons standing behind you and the light in your face while they ask you the questions. It's the same kind of environment.
Well, yeah, that's part of its value as an interrogation prop is, to the extent that the polygraph retains any mystique in the mind of the person who's being tested, it may give the interrogator a leg up in an interrogation.
So it's just like hypnotism in the sense that it is all ambiance, more or less.
Yeah, ambiance, ritual. And as to why the government continues to use it, well, another reason is they started long ago. And now when policymakers seek out opinions on polygraphy, they go to the people who have the most to hide, which is the polygraph operators themselves within their own agencies. And in the United States, there is a federal polygraph school called the National Center for Credibility Assessment at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And they control the federal budget for research into polygraphy and the detection of deception. So it's kind of like, having the tobacco industry in charge of lung cancer research. You have the people who have the most to hide controlling the research budgets. And so they don't do a lot of critical research into things like the test, retest reliability of polygraphy or the effectiveness of countermeasures. And to the extent that such research is done, it's classified. And even the National Research Council, which did a review of the evidence on the polygraph shortly after 9/11 in 2001, 2002, they were denied access to the federal government's research on polygraph countermeasures. even though they received the appropriate security clearances to review it. The government didn't want them looking at their research. So we've got disinformation and incentives to avoid asking critical questions built in to the federal government at this point. So I think we need public education and an informed populace before meaningful reform is going to take place. The politician, for example, now who suggests, well, you know, polygraphs aren't reliable, we should stop doing them. He could be attacked by a political rival as being weak on security or soft on crime. So we need to get to the point where when a politician says that the answer to our security problems is more polygraph testing, that people laugh with derision at any leader or administrator who would suggest such a ridiculous thing.
All right, we're going to get into how to beat the polygraph. And one of the things I'm curious about that is, you know, how do you change your heart rate? How do you consciously change your blood pressure? You know, things of that sort. So give us some clues. You said they're rating, they're measuring your sweat, your palm sweat,
right,
your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your breathing.
Yeah.
Was there anything else?
Blood pressure, breathing, heart rate. That's basically it.
Okay.
So these three indices. So what you have to do is first to understand the procedure. You have these relevant questions. In the case of an employment agency, it might be, did you ever use an illegal drug? Did you ever commit an undetected major crime? And did you withhold any information in your application? And typical control questions will be things like, did you ever lie to someone who loved and trusted you? Did you ever take anything from an employer, anything of value from an employer? Or did you ever lie to get out of trouble? And
now, as you said before, if you were to say to that question, like, did you ever lie to a loved one? What if you said, well, I feel like I did, but I can't remember exactly. But see, when you said before that once you unload on that, then somehow you're at greater risk.
Yes, to the extent that you should exhibit less anxiety when answering that question because you've unburdened yourself.
So then you would feel more anxiety when they ask the real question.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So answering the control questions honestly and candidly and fully doesn't actually help one to pass a polygraph. If it has any effect, it's likely to have the reverse effect and make one more likely to fail, even if one's telling the truth.
So don't clarify those questions when they ask you the control questions.
No, it's best to give the expected answer, which is usually a simple no. In some control questions, they expect a yes answer, for example, and another one is, are you truly an honest person?
Now, what happens
then? There is yes.
When they ask the question, have you ever lied to a loved one? Have you ever taken anything that didn't belong to you and didn't bring it back? And you say no, just a flat no to both of those questions. Don't they assume then that you lied on those questions? So how does that affect
yes.
the test?
Yeah. Well, they expect you to lie, and they want your answer to that ideally to be a lie, or at least give you concern, something that even if you're telling the truth, you'd show a reaction to it. So that is if you're telling the truth about the relevant questions.
If you tell that lie, knowing that that's what they expect, you're going to tell that lie completely calmly.
Well, that may be, which is why, as we described in chapter 4 of The Lie Behind the Lie Detector, there are other techniques you can do to mitigate the risk of wrongly failing the polygraph.
So you have to make yourself nervous when you ask that question. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, or at least to exhibit reactions that polygraphers expect to see from a nervous person when you answer the control questions.
How do we control that?
So there are two major approaches that have been tested in peer-reviewed research, and which showed that 50% of test candidates who were given a maximum of 30 minutes of instruction were able to pass the polygraph using these techniques. The first is to engage in mental activity. In the peer-reviewed research, it was picking an arbitrarily large number and counting backwards by sevens as quickly as possible. But you could, any mental activity would do. You could solve a math problem as quickly as you can in your head, a reasonably difficult one. Or you can think disturbing thoughts, like, as I mentioned to Nick Frost, I think falling off of a bridge or a cliff.
Now you do this when they ask you the questions where you're expected to be calm.
No, there's no question you're expected to be calm on.
Okay.
When you're asked the control questions, the ones that are used for comparison purposes against the relevant questions, the ones they really care about. So, yeah, so by augmenting your reactions to these control questions, you make yourself more likely to pass the test, less likely to fail. So there's mental activity, and this will often entail also a breathing reaction. The most common one that's seen is where the examinee breathes out and holds it for a few seconds and then resumes normal breathing. That's a very common reaction they expect to see, so it doesn't look funny or unusual to polygraph examiners. The second tested technique is to bite down on the side of your tongue hard enough to cause pain, but not hard enough to cause bleeding or serious damage. Mm-hmm. And this will tend also to result in suppression of breathing and a palmar sweating response. So this has also been tested in peer-reviewed research and shown to be equally effective as mental activity. I prefer the mental activity because I don't like pain, but either one might be effective, and they've been shown to be undetectable by polygraph examiners, and that's an important point.
Whereas if you're clenching your butt cheeks, people will notice that, right?
Right. Now that's one that we used to suggest, but there's now in many cases a piezoelectric sensor pad on the polygraph chair that might potentially detect such activity. So
really,
yes.
Okay,
so
what about there's clenching the colon?
No, it's the anal sphincter muscle.
Okay.
Has been the countermeasure. So there's no research published showing that these sensor pads are effective at detecting that countermeasure. But I think why take the risk?
So do the mental activity because that can't be detected no matter what.
It can't be detected, right. And recently, antipolygraph.org has received some leaked documents, case studies of what are called confirmed countermeasures cases where usually an applicant, I think in all of our cases, applicants were accused of doing something to try to manipulate the results, and they gave an admission to what they did. And we have dozens of these cases. They're published on antipolygraph.org with the polygraph charts, with the confession statements, and the interrogator's report. And what we found in each case is that these people who are being caught using countermeasures are doing something that no one who actually understands polygraph procedure would do. They would do things like, pressing their toes to the floor, or taking deep breaths, or breathing very slowly, trying to relax. Unsophisticated things that, even many truthful people might do just trying to stay calm, and they end up getting accused of trying to beat the test. And if they admit that, yeah, I was trying to breathe slowly to stay calm, they consider that a confirmed countermeasure case. But the sort of activity that we describe in the lie behind the lie detector, none of these case files document anyone who used these approaches that we describe and was caught doing it.
What if you say when you're going to go in that you're just going to try to breathe calmly and or breathe normal, take shallow breaths and seem calm or whatever? You can tell the people when they're talking about that, just try so that it doesn't look like you're gaming the system. But if you say it after the fact, that I was just trying to remain calm, then somehow it looks like you're gaming the system. Is that right?
Well, any mention of one's breathing to the polygraph examiner is asking for trouble.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's best avoided. Uh, of course, everyone who's polygraphed is conscious of their breathing because they put these tubes around your chest. And just as, when a doctor wants to measure your pulse, they might grab your wrist and pretend to be doing something else as a distraction. Um, so to avoid the lab coat effect, or perhaps it's the other way around. They do this, pretend to measure a pulse while measuring breathing, I think. With a polygraph, well, everyone is conscious that their breathing is being measured, and some people will just really relax and breathe slowly, trying to stay calm, thinking they're being cooperative, and they end up being accused of trying to beat the test. And for federal applicants for federal or any government employment, an accusation of trying to beat the test is worse than an accusation of simple deception with regard to any of the questions. So that's another curious thing, is that actually not trying to beat the test or to use countermeasures to reduce the risk of a false positive if you're truthful has not been shown to actually and using the countermeasures hasn't been shown to increase the risk of being accused of countermeasures, and not using countermeasures has not been shown to reduce the risk of a countermeasure accusation.
Okay, which is important to bear in mind. Now,
yeah,
you said that it was difficult to suppress a reaction to a question. So if you're worried about the way that they're measuring your heart rate or your blood pressure, it's not so much how you get your blood pressure down, but during the control questions, how you get your blood pressure up.
Correct.
So what would be a practice that would do that?
Well, that can be done by both of the countermeasures I mentioned to you: mental activity, such as thinking scary thoughts, solving a math problem quick in your head, counting backwards by sevens from an arbitrarily large number, or the pain of tongue biting.
Gotcha.
Can also do that.
Okay. And heart rate, is it correlated with the blood pressure, the same practices?
Yes. It can't be directly controlled, but this is as close as I've found documented in the research that it can be done. And I should point out that the U.S. government is extremely concerned about this information being public. There was a fellow in Texas, actually not in Texas, in Oklahoma, named Doug Williams, who has a website still online called polygraph.com, where he sold a manual called How to Sting the Polygraph, which he's been selling since 1979. He's a former police polygraphist who turned against polygraphy and started publicly speaking against the polygraph, and also selling a manual that would teach people how to protect themselves against it. So the U.S. government was not at all happy with this, and they devised a way to bring criminal charges against him by sending federal agents to seek his, not just only to buy his materials, but to seek in-person training with him. And then after the training was paid for, they'd admit that that they had done something that would preclude them from federal employment, or that one agent, that he had committed a crime that he was trying to conceal. And by that time, Doug Williams felt obligated to go through with the training, so he did. And he was charged with federal crimes, and he is in prison now. He's sentenced, I believe, to 2 years, and he's at a minimum security prison camp in Florence, Colorado. So the government takes this very seriously. Another man who had a similar business was also imprisoned for a few months before Doug Williams was charged.
And so
I attended the trial.
The important thing here is that the government is supporting this not on its scientific legitimacy, not for its accuracy, not for any defensible reason, but because of its application as an interrogation device.
Precisely. And it's working to suppress public understanding of polygraphy, and in particular, of the vulnerabilities of the test to countermeasures, to gaming by examinees. You know, at polygraph.org, our purpose is not to help spies, saboteurs, and terrorists to infiltrate the United States government. We make this information available because truthful people need a means to protect themselves against the risk associated with polygraphy, which is quite significant. The typical polygraph failure rates in federal agencies is on the order of 50% with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which started the criminal investigation against Doug Williams in Oklahoma. The failure rate is closer to 2/3. And given polygraphy's complete lack of scientific basis, it's clear that many truthful, honest, eligible applicants are being wrongly accused of deception, wrongly denied employment, and blacklisted.
And the skew of this is that the people that are more likely, because of the bias and the way it works against honest people, the more honest applicants, and therefore the better applicants for the position, are the ones that are being pushed aside.
Yes, straight arrows are more likely to get screened out by this invalid procedure than people who really did do some maybe petty thefts or lie a lot. And
the more disingenuous you are, the more likely statistically, or at least on the population level, statistically, that it's going to be the more disingenuous people that get through, and the more conscientious people are going to be discarded.
Perhaps. To my knowledge, no research has been done to examine that question. Again, there's very little quality research about polygraphy. A big reason is that serious scientists aren't interested in it because, you know, if you're a psychologist, this is, you know, pseudoscience. It's not something to spend your career working on.
Well, there's a great difference when people look at things on the statistical level or the population level. You know, there's much different indicators than when people look just at the the anecdotal exception.
Yeah. What I can say is I'm aware of no evidence that a polygraph screening program produces a more honest workforce. For example, we have 5 states where polygraph testing of public employees is not allowed. Those are Oregon, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. I'm aware of no data indicating that, for example, that police departments in these 5 states are more corrupt, more violent, have more disciplinary problems or complaints by the public than police departments in states where polygraphs are widely used. For example, Texas, Connecticut, where it's mandated that every police department must use polygraph screening.
I'd certainly like to see a study that reflects what I was talking about, the statistical probability of discarding the more honest applicant in favor of the more disingenuous applicant if they use a polygraph for that screening process.
Yeah.
The fact that it would actually, I think, work opposite of their goals. I would like to see such a study done. I would like to see it published, but of course you're saying that's not going to happen because scientists aren't interested, and also because the government doesn't want people to do that.
Yeah. Since most polygraph research is government funded, that's not the sort of question that they want to explore. In any event, it would be a difficult one. Knowing ground truth of who's the more honest applicant is really difficult, because who's going to admit that they're not qualified? Well, I suppose the most honest ones will, you know. So,
yep, it's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect. You know, that the more you know about a situation, the lower you rate your ability at it. But if you don't know anything about it, then you're going to rate yourself much higher. Last question: if you were going to try to decide whether someone is lying about a given situation, is there a way that you can that you know of that would actually work?
Well, I'm a former U.S. Army interrogator myself, and so I've been through the Army's interrogation school, although it's been some 30 years. But we had techniques that involved to get an idea if someone is telling you the truth. You'd ask questions to which you already know the answer to see if they answer those truthfully, and it would give you some indication of whether they're telling the truth or not. But beyond that,
there's not a biochemical test of that sort. The types of things that the polygraph. There's no kind of.
There's no physiological test for that. There's some other pseudoscience about body language. It's often called neuro-linguistic programming, which was actually taught to U.S. Army interrogators in the 90s. And things like if you look up and to the left or to the right, it means different things whether you're actually remembering something or making something up. And it's sheer pseudoscience too. So yeah, I think that the key to interrogation is building rapport with the person you're questioning and getting them to want to speak with you.
All right. Is there any last comment you'd like to make before we close the show out?
Yeah, well, I'd like to invite people who would like to know more about polygraphy to visit antipolygraph.org. And we've got a message board where people are welcome to post questions or commentary. And because I think this is my first interview for a Skeptic podcast, if anyone has constructive criticism for our site, things they think we could be doing better, I'd love to hear it.
Outstanding. All right, George Maschke, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for being on.
Thank you, Aaron. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Good night.